Phil Haack on DevOps at GitHub.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, welcome back to the Azure DevOps Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. You can always go on www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And our guest today is Phil Haack. Phil Haack was the main program manager for the ASP.NET MVC framework, and then he went to GitHub and was the director of engineering for the client apps group, and now is the man of mystery and leisure. Phil, great to have you on the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. It's great to be here.
Yeah, man. Now, I want to catch up and talk about what's been going on, but the audience for this podcast is people using the Microsoft platform to ship software. And so, Visual Studio is our world, and chances are they're using the MVC framework. Even with .NET Core, there's the design of the MVC framework and how it worked out. And for some of those who might not be familiar with your leadership back in the day, you actually came to Microsoft in order to be the chief of how the MVC programming model should be in a transition from web form. But walk us through that transition, just for those who haven't known you for a while.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I was, oh my goodness, that was a long time ago. You're like making me go back in the nostalgia machine.
2007, maybe?
So that was about 11 years ago, I want to say. And what happened was I was living in LA, working for a code search software company, and but interested in making the move to the big league, so to speak, right? Microsoft. And my wife and I, we took a trip up to Bellevue, Redmond to stay with some friends in Seattle. And I just borrowed their car, went to the Microsoft campus, and was like, oh, let's see who I run into. Like literally, no plans. I had lunch with a friend of mine who worked there. But after lunch, I just kind of hung around. I remember I saw Chris Sells in the hallway, and I was like, oh my God, hi. And then I ran into Scott Guthrie, and he's like, oh, what are you doing here? I was like, oh, just kind of looking around. He's like, oh, actually, I want to show you something. Are you going to be around later? And I was like, well, yeah, I'll make myself around. So at the end of his day, he met up with me and, showed me his office, and he wrote some code on the board, which was like an action method. And he said, this is what we're working on. And I said, wow, how do I work on that? And he's like, oh, well, if you're interested, let's talk. And so put me in touch with the Microsoft recruiting machine, and next thing you know, I had an offer, and I came on board to be the program manager for ASP.NET MVC. It's a good times. And, while at Microsoft, I was responsible, me and my team, we were responsible for shipping MVC 1, 2, and 3. And then I left around the time we were working on 4. But I also was the program manager for NuGet, which is a package manager for the .NET framework and Visual Studio.
Yeah, for those who haven't kind of been engaged through that period, the transformation of the programming model for web applications from a page lifecycle to more in line with HTTP and the MVC model that we have now, that along with package management, both of those have been transformational in the way that every .NET developer works today.
Yeah,
that's huge. You made a little mark.
I sure hope so. I mean, these ideas were not original with me, so I want to give credit where credit's due. These were things that were in other communities. What we try to do is to bring them into the .NET world and C# and Visual Studio in such a way that it kind of took relied on the benefits of all these things working well together. So as an example, we designed NuGet to be a class library that you could reference There was also a command line interface if you work that way. But we also built first class integration into Visual Studio. And, it's really funny because there's almost like each of these contingencies, these audiences would be like, why are you wasting your time on that? We don't care about that. And it's like, okay, well, it's not for you. But people, for example, who like IDEs like Visual Studio, they love that, like, totally integrated life cycle, right? I mean, that's why they're in an integrated development environment.
Sure.
But if you're a command line junkie, hey, we got something for you too.
Right. Well, man, GitHub was phenomenally successful in luring you away. And of course, we all know GitHub acquired by Microsoft, and that was a big old journey. But share with us what the high points were. That must have been an exciting time taking GitHub where it was in 2009, 10, maybe 11.
2011. Yeah, December 2011. So yeah, I joined GitHub. I was employee number 50. So I think if you count the founders, I was like, there's probably like 54 of us around the time. So relatively small. This is when GitHub was often in the news because of the way they worked. For example, they advertised the fact they had no managers, no meetings.
Yeah.
It was a very much, we aligned ourselves much like the open source community does, which is the open source community doesn't have a central leader. There's no some might say Linus, but there's no one person who's your boss, right? Like you're all volunteers. And even to this day, I think, especially in the tech field, when people have a lot of jobs available to them, I think it's good for managers and leaders to think of all their employees as not as indentured servants, but as volunteers and treat them accordingly, right? But anyways, that was a really exciting time. We felt like, even then I felt like this product is going to go places. It's just, we just need to execute well. And then, we basically, over the next 7 years experienced hypergrowth. So like I said, I joined around 50. When I had left, I think there was about 950.
Mm-hmm.
And we had just got acquired by Microsoft, which felt like to me like this beautiful full circle. When I heard the news, I was really excited because at that time I thought, if anyone is going to, I'm glad it's them. I felt like they would be good stewards of it because, in a way, almost because of their past and they've learned from those mistakes. And because, they're a company that actually sells software as opposed to just selling advertising or, whatnot.
Right. Now, you mentioned no managers, no meetings, and I'm going to dig in a little bit. Your title was Director of Engineering.
Oh, so not when I joined.
Okay. Did that change then? Okay. When did they start cropping up managers and meetings?
Okay. So when I joined, GitHub was in its what I would call like hipster punk phase, right? Like my offer letter literally said Windows badass.
Nice.
I hope that's acceptable for your podcast. It's like not that bad a word, but no, that was like literally on my offer letter. And I remember, I was talking to the CEO at the time, Chris, and he's like, "Hey, you're going to be working with a lot of external partners. Like, we're printing you some business cards. Do you want your title to be like VP of Product Development?" And I was like, "Sure, whatever." So like a lot of people had the title VP because GitHub didn't care about titles. Titles were purely external facing, not internal. Right. But, over the years as GitHub grew, it started to run into a lot of challenges with its scale and size. A key one, for example, is if there's no managers, who's responsible for giving you challenging feedback that's going to help you improve? Mm-hmm. It's very easy to give each other, "Hey, good job. You did, I really like that." But it's hard to say, "Hey, I think this could have been more effective if you'd done this," right? Like some people were really good at it, but there was no one responsible for it. So not everyone was getting that feedback. So we had a lot of challenges like that. And I was a true believer in the, we can make this work, right? Like if we go to first principles and look at the problems, like maybe a hierarchy is not the only way to solve the structure problem. Because the thing is, what we needed was structure. However, the leadership at that time decided, okay, let's add managers. And then not long after that, I became a manager. So, and I forgot to mention, I was hired as a programmer. So I went from being a PM at Microsoft to a programmer on GitHub for Windows, which was
you went back to being a programmer.
Yeah, exactly. I went back to being a developer, and ironically, on a WPF, client application. So, whereas at Microsoft I was building web apps or web frameworks, actually, then I was a client developer building a desktop application. Some of the most fun times I had in a while, because it was really nice to get back, knee deep in the code. We were learning reactive extensions and all this stuff. But then over time, we added managers, and then my team needed a manager, and nobody on the team had experience, and they weren't really interested in having someone from the outside come in. So it was like one of those things where everyone kind of looks at you and like, hey, you've been a manager before. And I was like, yes, I have. I'll do it. So I was reluctant, but I felt we had a special thing going, and I wanted to preserve that. So I dove into it, learned all I could about it. A couple years later, I became the director of the client applications, which was multiple teams. So the stuff we were doing outside of the browser grew. Like at first, it was just GitHub for Mac, GitHub for Windows. Then we combined those two into GitHub Desktop, and then we had Atom, which was a text editor. We had Electron, which is the framework that we used to build desktop, and we had Editor Tools, which was the team that built GitHub for Visual Studio, and they worked with the Visual Studio Code team to build the GitHub features for that, and also GitHub for Unity. So when I first joined, I was like, I was still like doing all kinds of C# and Microsoft Tech, right? WPF. And then I actually strayed like far away, because like most of my teams were doing things with Electron and, non-Microsoft Tech. But then, we had the GitHub for Visual Studio, and that was so we would work closely with folks over at Microsoft. So that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed all of that.
So along the way, when did GitHub start to distribute regionally? Like how much remote versus everybody in the same office?
So GitHub was pretty much from the very beginning somewhat distributed. Like the founders and the first few the founders were all from San Francisco, but they would often, work from coffee shops or work from different, home. And so, from the very beginning, that idea of not being in a single office was part of the DNA. And the first employee they hired was a support, depending on who you ask, whether he's first or second, but, I don't want to get in that argument.
Sure.
But he was actually in Colorado. So they, with the employee number one, he was distributed. And so what I loved about that, and I, worked from here in Bellevue, Washington, and I was even a director from Bellevue, Washington, and it wouldn't have made sense for me to work out of San Francisco because almost nobody in my team were there. Like I had 4 managers. One of them was in Oakland, which is about the closest to San Francisco, but the others were in San Diego. Actually, another one in San Francisco, and then one in blanking here. Washington D.C. or Maryland, and then one in Ohio for a while. So they were like all over the place. Right.
So how many leased offices did GitHub crop up? Like actually having office space and where you have a 3-year lease, whatever.
So I think a lot of the remote or distributed employees work from home, but the numbers have varied. I think, when I first joined, I would have guessed I think we'd said like 70% of us were distributed. I think by the time I left, it was more like 60. So there's a headquarters in San Francisco, and then they have like a office in Boulder. I think they have an office in Amsterdam, or a co-working space in Amsterdam. So they and the office in Tokyo. And then they might have other people are kind of free to if there's enough people who want to work together, they can kind of get the company to help pay for a co-working space and then work there. we had one for a short period out here in the Bellevue, Seattle area. But the problem is it's very widespread and none of us lived anywhere near. So nobody would go into this
didn't want to
space.
drive.
Yeah, nobody wants to drive. I'm like, yeah, my commute today is like I walk downstairs.
Right.
Why would I want to drive like 40 minutes, in traffic to,
Right.
not talk to these folks who are not on my team?
Which is an hour and 20 minutes every day.
Right, which is costly, to your not just gasoline and car maintenance, but health and your time.
Right, absolutely. Well, that's awesome. And then we've talked on the show about the GitHub acquisition and had some other guests talk about that and what a wild ride. So, what are you up to today? What are you working on?
These days, I'm kind of. I left GitHub about November last year, and I've been kind of working on my own little thing that I'm calling Haacked LLC. So Haacked, which is a play off my last name, also the name of my blog. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to take a lot of what I learned at GitHub and even at Microsoft prior, and help other companies become better or more effective, primarily through like coaching engineering orgs and leaders within a company. So I have 2 clients now. One of them is based in Seattle. One of them is based in Spain. And the one in Seattle, like for example, I've been doing a retainer model. So they just have a set fee a month, and then each week we have a meeting, and then they can just kind of email me or hit me up in Slack, and whatever questions or advice they need, based on my experience and knowledge, I help them out. And I really like it because I was telling someone it's almost like some of the best aspects of leadership without some of the most challenging parts. So, for example, if someone's like, hey, these two are in conflict, what should I do? And I was like, oh, well, I've run into this before. Here's, what you want to be aware of, yada, yada, yada. And I say, okay, good luck and let me know how it goes,
Right.
Right. Like I don't have to actually be the one like there, but I'm willing to do that too. But a lot of times, like, as a coach or advisor, like you want them to learn how to do those things, right? Like you don't want to be hand-holding them, but you want to arm them with the right information and the right context so they can do the best.
Well, that's awesome. So I think that you're also, I hear you're working on a book.
Yeah, so I'm working on a book with a former colleague of mine. In fact, she was the one who ran editor tools, so GitHub Visual Studio, all that stuff at GitHub. She just recently transferred to a position at Microsoft. So she's on the academic education team, something Azure over there. But her name's Sarah Guthels. She's really sharp. And so she started working on this book for Wiley called GitHub for Dummies, part of the For Dummies series. And she reached out to me and was like, hey, would you be interested in writing this with me? Because I think you have a lot of good insights. And I was like, I've already said I would never write a book again multiple times, but knowing that it was her and she's just on top of things and made it easy for me, I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And so it's going well. I think it should come out. It should be on sale or pre-order in June. I think it's on pre-order now, but I think it'll be on sale or available in June. So if you're familiar with the GitHub for Dummies series, they tend to be geared for novices. They mean dummies affectionately.
Of course.
And, we want to really help, especially young programmers or people new to GitHub to really get on their feet fast and make the most effective use of it. We talk about conventions as well, like how to be a good community member, how to start your own open source project. And, I have some tips on that. I think there's a lot of good stuff even for expert folks and people who have used GitHub for a long time, because between the two of us, we know a lot of the nooks and crannies of GitHub that not a lot of people even know are there. So we try to cover all of that. The challenge, of course, is that it's a book. And ever since Nat Friedman took over GitHub has been on a tear, shipping new things. And so we've had to, rewrite certain sections of the book, but at some point, we can't keep doing that.
Right.
So the book will be, there will be some parts of it out of date, but we try to focus a lot on core principles and the things that, there might be additions by the time the book is out, but none of the stuff we've written about should be, out of date per se. It's just that there may be more things you can do.
Right. Now, this is a DevOps podcast, and when I think of GitHub, I think of an organization that has put out features at a really fast clip for a really long time and has a pretty good quality track record at the same time, quality and stability. What are the major strategic decisions that you guys made that gave you the ability to do that? If you're telling the DevOps at GitHub story, what are those key aspects?
Several things that come to mind. One is that GitHub, as a core value, one of the most precious and prized values, is shipping. Like they believe in shipping, and so they optimize around shipping, right? And so I think I couldn't tell you the exact numbers, but I remember like hearing that we would ship to GitHub.com like 100 times a day. And so, prior to GitHub, on projects that I've been on, like prior to Microsoft even, like, we'd ship once a month or something like that to a website. Right. And so the idea that you could ship 100 times a day, just kind of mind blowing. And so they really optimized towards that workflow. The other thing they are really big on is trying to automate all the things. So Hubot is a chatbot framework that they had built in-house, and it's actually available on hubot.github.com. And they make an intensive use of that as part of the day-to-day workflow. So you can actually deploy from the chat room. You can deploy to a lab environment from the chat room. You can get the status of anything from the chat room. So we used to be, like we would have graph commands. So it's like, hey, graph me the last week of requests per hour, blah blah blah, right? And then you get a graph right in the chat room, and then people could see how you did it, because it's in the public chat room, and that's how this communal knowledge of how we deploy things, how we get the status of things, how we ship things gets shared throughout. And the other aspect, of course, is, we use GitHub to ship GitHub, right? And so pull requests and the pull request discussions, and using pull requests as a means of, iterating on code and getting it out there is very important to the GitHub culture. GitHub, a lot of times people think of a pull request as the thing you do at the very end of getting a feature out. But GitHub would often look at it as the beginning. Like you might create a pull request with just one commit, and then continue to add commits to it and work on it over time and then ship it. Thankfully, the challenge with that workflow was that then you had to have some convention of saying, oh, this is a work in progress, it's not ready to be merged. But GitHub just recently, after all these years, shipped a feature where you can have your pull request be explicitly a draft pull request.
Oh, nice.
And until you mark it as ready for review, it cannot be merged or reviewed. Yeah.
So it makes it visible while still continuing to add commits to that pull request.
Yeah, and it prevents. So it doesn't do the code owner's notification or anything or reviewer's notification. So the idea there is that, like, if you're a reviewer, you won't get notified that, oh, there's this draft PR, so it doesn't take your valuable attention. But if you're interested in it, you can always go in and add comments and all that. But when they mark it as ready for review, then all the people who absolutely need to review it will then get notified.
Yeah, it's an interesting separation of information. You have, whether it's a work item or a GitHub issue, you have a feature definition, which is being coded up, but then that pull request gives you the surface area to have an ongoing discussion about the code and how the code is shaping up.
Exactly.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So let's take it one piece at a time just so the listeners can understand. You have the github.com, and you said 100 times a day to the website. Now, architecturally, on the spec, is this one website or 200 different web applications that make up all the URLs of the website? Where is it on that spectrum?
GitHub.com, at least at the time that I left, is primarily one Ruby on Rails web application. Okay. There are a bunch of different supporting services, though, right? For example, gRPC, like Git over RPC, or we had something called Spokes, which is the system for doing redundant Git operations, so you could have every repo on 3 different servers. So there's a lot of different services. So I don't know the total number.
Okay. So visually, the Ruby on Rails, there was one web application for the visual pages, but then you had other applications for APIs, and then a lot of headless services running around in the background. What was the scale? A dozen? 100?
So unfortunately, I didn't really work in the backend side of things, so I don't know the actual number, because I would only hear about these things through discussions, and so it felt to me like dozens, but it could have been in the scale of hundreds. They have a whole framework for spinning up services on GitHub's bare metal in a way that feels like you're spinning it up in the cloud, and so people could spin up a ton of services. Yeah, and now that I think about it, for example, I was in charge of the client applications, but we actually had our own service that we would send all our telemetry data to, and that we used to handle our deployments. Now, we didn't deploy 100 times a day, because if you got 100 updates to Visual Studio a day, you would probably find me and throttle me, right? So we try to generally keep a monthly cadence on most of our stuff.
Okay, so you had the client application, you had some services. Was there a standard pipeline structure that GitHub maintained, or that was a common set of steps? Or was everybody's service just, hey, ship it however you can?
It depends, right? If you're working on anything that's like github.com, there's, as you might imagine, a lot more controls, attention to that. We definitely had, on the things that, even with the small service, if you spun up a service to support something you're doing, we would involve security reviews and all that stuff. But the deployments might be very different based on your needs versus .com's needs. And so there wasn't a strict standard protocol, but the standard protocol was more in principle, always get security reviews, always get privacy reviews, that sort of thing.
Well, maybe we can talk about the services that you work with more closely. If just taking it one step at a time, you commit something to the Git repository for that particular service. Well, first of all, Git repository organization. If you had multiple services and then the client application, did you have a separate Git repository for each one of those, or one Git repository for your team with multiple independent services?
So, great question. Yeah, we actually had multiple organizations in GitHub. So, for example, the desktop application, one of the things unique about my team is everything we did was open source. And so we didn't necessarily want those in the GitHub org, because, we were concerned about accidentally giving some outside person access to things they shouldn't have. So we would set up the desktop org for GitHub Desktop. We set up the editor tools org for all of those. We set up Atom org for Atom. And we set up the Electron org for Electron. Now, it made sense for another reason, is that Atom actually is a whole bunch of repositories, because there's the core Atom editor, but there's also all the different packages for Atoms. Each of them would be a different repository. Electron's similar, there's the core Electron, but there's also these tools and other testing tools and all these different things. So we could group them all in the Electron org. And so So my team was worked very differently from the rest of the GitHub org because we had a ton of repos and we were working with the community, and we would deploy once a month. But when we did, we would do it like desktop, for example, and Adam would deploy for Mac and Windows, and then we also would try to help the community supported Linux version. So we didn't officially support Linux, but we wanted there to be a Linux version out there, so we would work with the community on that.
Right. Yeah, the industry is having a conversation about how big a Git repository should have, and it sounds like every independent unit in your case had its own Git repository. So armed with that, you had many of these. So I'm guessing each one you had many continuous integration builds, one per Git repository.
Yeah, so continuous integration was really interesting within my team because none of the existing providers at the time supported all the platforms we cared about, right? And GitHub.com only needs to run on the platform it runs on, right? So there's only needs the one CI. Sure. But desktop, we really wanted to run on Mac, Windows, and Linux. So we want a CI provider for Mac, CI provider for Windows, and CI provider for Linux. And so we were paying 3 times, for every single, and for Electron, which is a huge bill because it builds Chromium. That was a big bill. And then, for all these things, the nice thing about GitHub for Visual Studio, we only needed one. We use AppVeyor because Visual Studio only runs on Windows, right? Like the particular one we target. I know there's Visual Studio for Mac, but it's different. But we actually started switching even before the announcement. So this had nothing to do with Microsoft acquisition. We started switching to Azure pipelines, which was then called, Azure
VSTS.
CI.
It was just VSTS.
Oh, VSTS, yeah.
It was the VSTS Build Hub.
Yeah, whatever it was called. When I remember, I was talking to folks over there, I think Jamie Cool, and he said we're going to support Mac and we're going to support Linux. And I thought, oh my goodness, if I could just have a single provider, a single YAML file, but build these apps on all 3 platforms, that would just make my life so much easier. I wouldn't mind paying for that, right?
Right.
They were very kind because these were open source projects that were significant. They hooked us up with some open source CI, which they then, because this was before they had made the public announcement. But now, as I understand it, Azure Pipelines is actually free for open source. So that got expanded to everybody. So, but yeah, I was really excited about that because that just, if you're building an Electron app and you want to target all 3 platforms, it's such a great option because it really simplifies your whole CI story. And,
right. You have to do it 3 times over.
You don't have to do it 3 times. Yeah.
Okay. So let's say the services, one platform because you're running the services on the back end. So for the CI build, obviously you do a compilation and versioning. What types and what quantity of automated testing did you pack into the CI build?
Each of our apps had hundreds of tests, so depending on what it was, right? But so we used, for example, desktop was TypeScript. So I don't actually, I'm blanking on what test framework they use, whatever those TypeScripters or JavaScript folks tend to use, probably Mocha. But they had, I don't really know how many tests exactly they had, but they had a lot of tests. The things that I had actually, so the desktop app, I hadn't actually written code for that because that was like a rewrite of what I had done previously. But GitHub for Visual Studio, I actually started that project and I actually, wrote a lot of code for that. And that one, we had that was C#. So we had a ton of tests using XUnit. We run all of our tests on the CI machine.
Did you have any static analysis baked into there, or what other significant things happened in the CI build step?
We tried to have everything that would run on CI pretty much could be run on your local machine, right? And so we would have static analysis. So for Visual Studio, for example, code analysis, we'd run that, right? The Visual Studio code analysis. We would run all our XUnit tests. I think we started looking into integration and UI testing as well in some of these different areas.
Did you find any good frameworks that worked out in that space?
Yeah, no. I think, well, the problem, so my challenge with UI testing is that UI is one of the more fragile, brittle things, right? Like it changes a lot. And if it changes, suddenly all your tests fail or don't work anymore.
Yeah. If you change your locator.
Right. And I feel like the bang for the buck there, ends up being low. So, we had actual testers and we would employ exploratory testing, because the other thing that an automated test can't tell you is, does this UI make sense? Does this understandable to a human? And that's where a really good tester is not just testing, hey, does this work? But from a functionality, does this do what the spec requires? But they're also testing does this work from can a human use this and get their job done, right? And that's even more important. Yeah. Yeah. How's this feel to use? Is this, could this be simpler to use? Could this be more self-explanatory? That yada, yada. So we would combine that with, unit testing and, use that to kind of help ensure that our quality was high. So our CI didn't, like a CI ran, and any of those tests you could run on your local machine. Obviously, the benefit of just pushing and running on CI is that we had beefy machines, and so they run it faster, and they would update the pull request status so that you could also see, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's all I can think of right now. Okay. We definitely ran static analysis. Yeah,
and so I know the WPF and the client portions, they weren't automatically deployed to the end user, but for the where you did have an automated deployment between environments, what tools did you use? What methods did you use for those deployments, from straight PowerShell to a commercial product? How did that look?
So we actually did have automated deployments for the WPF app, and then later on for the Electron app, because one of my colleagues at the time, Paul Betts, had built a system called Squirrel.
Okay.
And it was...
Yeah, we've used that before. It's awesome.
Yeah, so we actually started off with Click Once, but we would run into so many problems, and it felt to us like there was a lack of investment there. And so we built our own system. So once you installed the program using a normal, double-click MSI or XC, updates would be delivered automatically through Squirrel. And so what would happen is, you're running the app and you see this little notice saying, hey, an update's available. Do you want to load it? You click it, and then you're up to date. And so it's a beautiful way of updating the app. And so we got it to a point where we could deploy our client apps through Hubot. So you might say, deploy this branch to staging, and then we test the app out, make sure everything's in, and then deploy this branch to production, test it out, make sure everything went smooth, and then we would merge that branch into master once we were comfortable that we weren't going to have to roll back. Mm-hmm. So master for us always represented, a stable point.
Yeah. So for the services where you were going to deploy it to GitHub servers that were going to be run on and just work on the background, how many environments did you set up in the deployment pipeline ahead of production?
Oh, interesting. So I'm ashamed to say it, but so we had this one service for client apps. For the longest time, we only had a production environment for it, in part because it wasn't mission critical. It was just, if it went down, the end users would never notice, right?
Sure,
we would just lose a little bit of telemetry data, which, isn't actually good.
Oh, yeah. Not mission critical. Yep.
Yeah, not mission critical, but not a good thing to admit. Part of the problem was we were this oddball within GitHub in that we were all client application developers, and we didn't have a team working on the server. So we kind of would patch this together with whoever had some bit of Rails expertise.
Gotcha.
Actually, this might have been No, it was a Rails app. Yeah. And so over time, though, like, as we got, as we started to get better at, like, getting people from other teams to pay attention to what we were doing, we could get some help here and there. And so we actually made it a 2-server setup so that we could, spin one down and the other up. They were both production, but we didn't set up a staging environment. But we at least had like redundancy. So if one went down, the other one was still up.
Right. Maybe similar to Blue Green.
Yeah. Like, whereas GitHub.com, much more sophisticated in how they deploy, right?
Sure.
Like they have you can choose to just deploy to production, but they also have lab environments. So you can deploy to specific lab machines or do a partial rollout. So you could say, hey, deploy this to 20% of our servers. And then we also have sophisticated tools for doing A/B testing, both in UI, but also in code paths. So in fact, I worked on a library that is called scientist.net, which is for doing A/B testing of code paths. And that's recently, Brendan Forster over at GitHub has recently been kind of getting the community involved with that because when I left, it was in the GitHub org. I could no longer work on it. And I was like, I think there are people in the .NET community who might still find this useful. So now they're trying to put it into a proper open source org and give it over to the .NET community to continue it on. And so I'm pretty excited about that.
It's called scientist.org?
Scientist.net is the name of the library. So I think in NuGet, it's just scientist in NuGet.
Okay. Gotcha. So for deployments itself, you mentioned that there was starting to be a transition to Visual Studio Team Services, but for deployments
that's
itself,
just for my team.
Okay. What were the major tools on the deployment side?
I mean, the main tools that we would use, like I mentioned earlier, is we used Hubot, which interface with. We had some very interesting product names. So we had internal tools called Heaven, and which was also managed by a tool named God. Heaven God.
Hey, there you go.
I don't know why these were named what they were, but they were the systems that we would use to manage deployments and rollouts of the client applications. So we could actually deploy to like a beta channel, things like that. And then all of that was interfaced with Hubot. So I could just use a Hubot command to roll things out. These were all internal tools. And then, the main thing is like they would interface with the CI that we would use. So initially we were using AppBear, Circle CI, Travis CI. But we were, I think they're still using all those, but they also are transitioning to Azure pipelines, because of the cross-plat.
Yeah, it sounds like in the era that you guys were really growing and establishing all these things, there weren't many good commercial options for deployment products. You just had to build your own. Whereas today, you've got Octopus Deploy, you've got Azure DevOps Services, the Release Hub, and more popping up just because everyone's realizing, hey, we automate deployments. Oh, let's do that.
Right. Yeah, and GitHub has its own deployment primitives. I wouldn't call it a deployment system like Octopus Deploy or whatnot, but its own primitives that a lot of those tools will take advantage of, deployment API. And so we built these internal tools that would use GitHub's deployment API to kind of manage these things. And I think in part because, we had these tools around for a very long time.
Right.
In fact, we were using the same tools that GitHub.com was using. So we would just we don't need to go buy this other thing. We'll just use these tools. Now, over time, it might make sense for the client apps to do that, but it was just faster and easier for us to use the tools we already had. Right.
Awesome. Well, before we go, it's fascinating hearing the DevOps story at GitHub. But before we go, is there anything else that our listeners should follow up on and go research?
That's a great question. I mean, I would say reiterate, if you're doing if you're building an Electron app or any kind of cross-platform app, definitely, look into Azure pipelines in terms of deployment, or for CI, because I think having a single interface for all your different platforms is really valuable. It's not to say like all the other providers are really good and they each have their strengths and weaknesses. But for Electron apps, for example, I really found that to be useful. But other than that, like check out Hubot, hubot.github.com, and see if that, is something that like it's kind of more of a layer on top. That's really neat. It's not like the thing that will do the deployments or anything, but it's kind of a nice way of what we would call chat ops, right? A nice way to do chat ops. And the benefit of chat ops is like by having these commands in the public, internal public.
Sure.
Every time you run a command, you're teaching someone else how to do it, and that's really cool. Which is particularly important for a distributed company because I'm not sitting there watching you do it, but I can come in, 3 hours later, scroll back through the transcript and see, oh, that's how you deploy to production. Good to know.
Yeah. Right. And well, shoot, AI, if you take the chat interface and then you layer on some speech recognition, I mean, then, well, shoot, now you've got Cortana and Alexa and Yeah, we never went there, but that would be an interesting thing to play around with. And I have a lot of spare time on my hands, so maybe I'll have to try some of that out. Awesome. Hey, well, thanks so much, Phil, for visiting with me. This is great.
Oh, yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.